It's working? Yes. Hi, so I work for Democracy International. It's a German NGO working on democratic reform in the EU. And I'm just going to try to comment a bit on what was said earlier and then draw a little bit from our experience as a sort of a grassroots civil society initiative. So today we heard a lot about what is wrong with democracy. And we've heard a lot of things. And I'd just like to think for a moment about what is democracy and what are the goals of democracy. We've heard a lot about participation today, right? Expressing the will of the people, popular sovereignty. And David, you were talking about, democracy is not an aristocracy. It's not about rule by the best and the brightest. And elections theory has aristocratic elements, as you said, and Rousseau himself has the position of an enlightened legislator to help express the general will, because they're all scared that ordinary citizens cannot think beyond their self-interest, cannot think about the general will. So democracy, we've heard democracy is about people having an equal say. But I think alongside democracy being about self-determination and about citizens being the sovereign, democracy is also about outputs. It's also about outcomes. And so when we think about, what is a democracy, and say we think about democracy in a nation-state kind of perspective, then we presuppose individuals who possess human rights, right? And if we think about sort of human rights from sort of the capability approach, think of Amartya Sen, and so it's about human beings are human beings only by virtue of being able to do a certain number of things. They should enjoy a certain level of prosperity and welfare, which are also goals of the EU. So democracy also becomes about outputs, and I think the point I'd like to emphasize is that we need to improve participation, not just for the sake of participation, but also because it leads to better outcomes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important for us from a grassroots perspective. It's something we learned a lot also in our previous campaign. We ran a campaign on the convention, on an EU convention on treaty reform, and the idea was to build grassroots support for a convention. And what we realized was, trying to build partnerships, is that people don't really care about learning about democracy in the abstract. People just don't want to have a say for the sake of having a say. People want to have a say so that they can get a certain kind of outcome. So this campaign wasn't very successful in the traditional sense because it's not something democracy in the abstract is not something you can sell or convince the people about. And then maybe I'd just like to talk about the new sort of initiative that came out of our previous campaign. We're now working on designing the framework of the next EU convention, trying to propose a better framework. And there too, the questions of input and output are very important and quite complicated, even relating to the question of the referendum. I mean, should we, is it a good thing to have a referendum on an EU treaty? I'm not very sure, and we do need to think about the output. We do need to think about what it means to have an EU treaty fail in a referendum. And, so is a binary choice on, a 600-page document written by experts a good thing to put to the people? I'm not very sure. And something quite, am I done?
No. Oh. Do continue.
Right. And something to think about is, how can we be creative with things like referendums? There's a scholar at Oxford who some of you might be familiar with, Calypso Nicolaidi. She writes about preferenda, so upstream referenda, saying we don't give people an ex post facto kind of choice in the end, take it or leave it. It's giving them a question, three different choices perhaps, not breaking the binary as well, and getting their views in upstream while the decision making is taking place. So if you're asking people, all along the process, also sort of like elections. It's not just like a one-time thing. It's in stages. So so our new initiative is going to be working on designing a new framework for the next EU convention. We're also, as Ms. Fonseca was saying, we're also lobbyists for democracy. So change making in Brussels doesn't just happen always from the grassroots. It's not always simple from the grassroots. With this, once we come up with this framework, bringing together scholars from both the national level, politicians from the national and the EU level, and scholars, we hope to place the document in the right drawers, in the right cabinets, in the back rooms of the European Parliament and the national parliament, so that when the discussion about the next convention starts, people already have something to think about. And hopefully we're able to make a change that way. So, thank you.
Thank you. I might be a bit slow, but what comes out of the conventions actually? I mean, people are saying what they want. People are saying what they mean. People are trying to influence the way a constitution is written that sort of way. But what comes out of it, what practical politics is concerned? I mean, you still have to have a government in a society, haven't you? And it should be based on some sort of parliamentarian balance, one way or the other.
Right. So in an EU convention usually, well, in the past, if I'm right, has not involved citizens really. It's been, members of national parliament, members of European Parliament, members from the Commission, and from the government. And they discuss a certain agenda. There was a convention on coming up with the Charter for Human Rights, and the last one on the future of Europe, the Constitution of Europe. So, but then too, the proposals of the convention go to the Intergovernmental Conference, where they must again be approved. So yeah.
Ah, and then easing its way into the system anyway. That way, yeah. Svein Rotevatn.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Sveinung. I am 27 years old, from Nordfjordeid in Sogn og Fjordane, and I'm here to represent the elected aristocracy.
After the revolution, that is.
And I have to say that as a newly elected member of parliament and as a politician, I have to say it's a bit hard to be pessimistic on behalf of democracy, at least from my perspective, where I travel the country every week, meet thousands of people, get their input, try to put forward the best argument, the most persuasive argument, get support, getting re-elected, and debating with everyone about anything. And I think that the key factor that you also have to remember when we're talking about democracy is, at least for my part, I have a fundamental belief in the cleansing and enlightening effect of public debate. And I think we see this at play in Norway right now, where we, for the first time in 8 years, have a budget that has been put forward by a minority government, meaning that it doesn't automatically get approved by Parliament. And this has led to a huge public debate, and I think we're going to see that many changes are going to be made in the budget as a result of the public debate, including changes that none of the parties really hadn't even thought about before the debate started. So having a strong and competent media, strong competent NGOs, a public debate is, in my opinion, vital for democracy to work. However, I think there are certain aspects of our society and also many other countries that give a reason for worry. I think one of them is the diminishing numbers of party membership, which you see all over the board. And in Norway, to be fair, a lot of decisions and a lot of power rests within the political parties, the party faithfuls, the party membership base, especially when it comes to nominating candidates for parliament. It is virtually impossible for the average voter to change the lists of the parties when it comes to picking who gets to get elected into parliament. They can just vote for the party. And I think this is one of the areas where you have to see change in our election system. Luckily, we see tendencies to certain parties, at least in our country, that have started to pick up on these worries, that have implemented reform, that are focusing more on, say, primaries, more open primaries within their party to elect candidates, not just having, committees appointing them. So, of course, there are also positive things happening, I think. When it comes to the presentations we saw earlier, which I think are very interesting, and read your book, Mr. Van Raybroek, and I think it's certainly a bit mind-numbing for a lot of people, I think, to read and to reflect on the ideas that we always held to be true, what democracy was supposed to be about, and to go back in history and see that there are, in fact, alternatives, not to participation, but to the way we participate. Now, I don't think I'm quite ready to jump on board with the idea that you should just, and it's not really what you're proposing either, to change the entire system with a system of a lottery, for example. But I am indeed open to ideas of supplementing our current institutions. And I think that you should always be open to new ideas. For example, to supplement, an elected chamber with a chamber picked out of different methods, a lottery or something like that. Of course, it could be interesting. But I have to say that locally in Norway, you see that people's participation is in fact quite common. When it comes to urban planning, for example, and important decisions being made on the local level, town hall meetings are very common. Yep. They have a lot of influence. Unfortunately, you don't always see that much participation. So getting people engaged is, of course, the key issue, and it doesn't come easy. So I have to say I'm always open to looking at a system in a different way. I think we should, indeed, on the European level as well. But being a Norwegian citizen, you must never forget the, of course, most important democratic deficit that we have, which is the EEA agreement, which is, in my opinion, the ultimate defeat of democracy. So the ultimate defeat of democracy, being the EEA agreement, accepting all decisions from the European level without participating in any level, because you chose to not participate. So, of course, that is the most fundamental flaw in our democracy that we have to fix, and I don't doubt that the European movement in Norway is keen to do that, and now all we need to do is to get the people on board and get them to participate. Thank you.
How will you do that?
Well, we've tried a couple of times, haven't we? No, in Norway you have a strong tradition of holding referendums when it comes to the question of joining the European democracy or the European Union. And right now the people don't seem too eager to join, and this sentiment has been persistent for the last, not decade, but at least 6 or 7 years. So I think you need to see changes within the European system, probably. You need to see the arrows pointing up, and perhaps, unfortunately, you might need to see the arrows pointing down a little bit in Norway, because what you have seen is that the Norwegian people's will to join the European Union or not is fairly closely linked to economic issues and how things are going. So we'll see. But I always try to make the democratic argument. That is the most important argument, and I will keep making that argument.
I'll give you the word in a second. I just have a small follow-up on that. I mean, there is a problem seen as I see it, and quite a lot of other people see it, that the politicians, the political leaders of this country, are so afraid of putting their hands into the beehive of emotions and strong feelings and traumatic experiences and whatever that is the question of the EU, that you actually get a watering out situation of your argument from the parliament. Should politicians be expected to take more of the initiative to get this debate into a more realistic track?
Perhaps they should, but also they've tried a couple of times. You've had a persistent majority in the Norwegian Parliament for joining the EU for 50 years' time, but you basically never have had a majority of the people, just in short periods. And of course, the problem with charging into the debate and holding another referendum is that if you lose the referendum, you postpone the debate for another 20 years again. And I think that's what a lot of politicians are worried about. But of course, if the Norwegian people doesn't want to take part in that democracy and they feel that other arguments are more important for them, that's up to them, I think. But I think we as politicians have a responsibility to be open about the limitations of our current system, to be open about the huge disadvantages it gives us as a nation, and then it's up to the people if they want to hear that argument.
Yeah, well, don't quite agree, but we can
May I
come back to that.
tie in? If
David, yeah.
there's an opinion in Parliament and there's a referendum put to the Norwegian public, I'm wondering, it's actually a question for David. Would you use the Irish model to solve this issue in Norway?
I think it's a really good question. I'm just listening to you and I'm saying, do what we've done. You know, you've got the perfect situation. You've got, as you said, a large number of the elite who would like to see a serious possible debate, but they're scared of the possibility that they'll lose a referendum. So get the citizens in the room with them.
Yeah.
Spend a bit of money, and you've got plenty of it, and have a discussion. Have a serious, sustained, deliberative forum. That would be a wonderful initiative. And by the way, it'd be great to study it.
So the question is also to some extent that by raising the question in the right way, in the right forum, you will make people think twice about these things. Because when you say that the public has this opinion and the poll shows us that this is what people mean, I wouldn't immediately think that's right. Perhaps they think, but they don't really know what to think, because nobody had dared to actually raise the questions in its full breadth, in a way.
I think it's a very interesting proposal, and I would love to do it in Norway, definitely. But then again, and I have no doubt in my mind that a deliberative model would lead to a conclusion that you should participate in the European democracy. I'm faithful that would be the conclusion, but then again, you'd have to seek another referendum, I think. And you should also, at least in the Norwegian tradition, and you should also not underestimate how informed people are, at least how informed they were back in 1994 when we did have a referendum. You know, you had a participation rate of close to 90%, a huge public debate for years. So I think we should be careful not to say that the people weren't informed back then. I'm pretty sure they were informed, they were just wrong.
David, how would you do it, David? How would you do it here in Norway?
Yeah, I mean, it would be the sort of thing that you did with the G1000. It would be, you go into the room with a very generic idea for a discussion. So you're not going in with a very fixed agenda saying, at the end of this process, you are going to decide this. You go into the room saying, let us allow space for a discussion, facilitated discussion about the future of Norway's relationships with the European Union, something as vague as that, and see what emerges from that process. No, you know, allowing for the possibility that what could emerge in that process is an agreement that actually where we are is about as good as we're ever going to get. You allow scope for them to decide anything. You don't set it up in a way that its critics could from the beginning dismiss it as a stitch up to try and bring Norway into the European Union. Yeah. I think allow it space. You need to spend the money and allow it a year, allow a lot of time. I think you should try it.
Otto?
Yeah, and just a follow-up question on that. I mean, how do you make sure that the deliberation and the proposals and the outcomes from this sort of a convention or an assembly actually come to bear on decision making? Because I feel like this is a problem we also face on the European level, something we faced with the convention as well, where the convention made proposals and then it went to the IGC and the Presidium, and Giscard d'Estaing, who just threw out whole bits of things that the convention had worked upon. So what can we do to make sure that this thing actually translates to policy decisions? Yeah,
and that's a really hard nut to crack, isn't it? I mean, you need to by including the politicians in the room with them. You're saying to the political class, you're part of this also. So you're mixing politicians with ordinary citizens, and by running the process over a long enough period of time, you could then achieve what we, I think, achieved to some degree, but ours was by no means a perfect experiment, which is the journalists who start off as universally critical observe it, come along to the meetings, and actually they change their minds. So we've had some very prominent journalists who are now saying, okay, this is actually worth considering.
Would you put journalists at the table as well?
That would be worth considering. I mean, certainly I certainly would bring the civil society groups into the room
Right.
as witnesses. I wouldn't leave them out.
Well, we discovered the two biggest enemies of this democratic innovation are political parties and mass media,
Yeah.
because they are the gatekeepers. So I think in Ireland was the first time in history that politicians were invited at the table. But next step might be inviting journalists as well.
And I think it would really help in this sort of constructing a narrative as well, and having that narrative be there for how decisions were made. This is something we want to do with our convention framework when we bring together our group of politicians and scholars, is to also have journalists so they know about the whole process and can write about it.
So,
If we talk about the plug-in of a deliberative process, I think there are four models. What do you do with the results of it? Either it goes to parliament, it goes to government, it goes to a referendum, or it's accepted right away. Ideally, number 4 should be fine.
Yeah.
When we have jury duty in justice, if a child molester in Belgium is being judged by 12 members of the Belgian population, there's not a referendum afterwards to ask, do you agree with that or not? We believe that the 12 who have been drafted represent us and can make a decision on their own.
That's exactly right.
that's right. We have 3 entries from the audience in the name of democracy. Is the lady with the scarf there first?
Yes, my name is Anne Berg. I come from Nordland County. Isn't it true that it's the elites of society, whether they're politicians, businessmen, scientists, that promote the changes or bring society forward? And if you go back and ask the local community, they usually say no. We want it as it is. I have been following a little the debates around in my county now, around the putting together communities, making larger entities of the communities. They usually end up by, we want status quo. We don't want to join anyone, We like it as it is. And if you look to Switzerland, when did the women get the vote there? After the Second World War, because they have referenda on everything. And in my opinion, local communities, urban or little rural communities, they usually want the status quo. They don't want change.
Yeah.
I would like to hear what you think.
Can I give you a direct experience from the Irish Constitutional Convention? The weekend when we were discussing same-sex marriage. Do you know the phrase, when the hair stands up on the back of your neck? I don't have much of it left, but I still get the follicles standing up when something really emotive happens. And during the course of that weekend, quite late in the weekend, one of the older male citizen members who had hardly said a thing throughout the entire process stood up, asked to speak. And he didn't form his words very well. He's obviously not used to public speaking. But the gist of what he said was, when I was a young boy, I was raped by a man. And I always hated gay people. And I would never vote for gay marriage. And after listening to what I've listened to, I'm persuaded. So he changed. His view changed. And that's the sort of thing that you'll get with this kind of deliberative approach.
My hair is standing up now.
Oh,
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Mine too. So I know.
Well, I think it's fair to say that when people are, at least when people are uninformed, they tend to have a conservative reflex facing most propositions to change anything. So when you hold referendums, be it locally or nationally, you're totally dependent on having an informed debate, a long debate, and a good debate, I think. But I don't think you should distrust the people. But I think it's fair to say that experience is a good thing. And you see that, in my opinion, at least when you look at the people who are ministers in Norwegian governments, that in several governments, at least in my opinion, you see the tendency that the most experienced people who are appointed to be ministers are the ones who are able to drive through change, whilst the ones who aren't as experienced within the political system tend to become hostages to the civil service and to the experts within their own departments. So I think having political experience is a good thing if you want to drive through reform, at least.
Okay, the next one was Nayus, and you thereafter, and then you, and then.
Christian, first of all, thank you for raising the dreaded elephant of possible membership again for Norway, because the kind of mantra that's been since 1994, that you can't possibly mention it because it could create all kinds of problems again. We're back to civil war, as Torvald used to say many years ago.
It's my usual masochistic experience.
No, now you're retired, you can have it again.
Yeah.
But basically, it's not necessarily a debate about, oh, let's have a membership issue again. It's about focusing attention of the parliamentary groupings, parties, if you will, on the issues in Europe that are real. Don't have to even talk about the membership issue, but so that the involvement in Norway is not restricted continually to the mantra, oh, we can't touch it. Anyway, thank you for raising that. Could I just say that this interesting, very interesting debate, and congratulations to the European movement for this day, the notion of democracy and the definition. And we've had many different kinds of definition. Mr. Churchill said that democracy was the worst possible thing, except that it was better than all the other things. I like the idea of, somebody mentioned the Greek city-state. One of the Greek city-states had a wonderful idea, which maybe we should develop. If you had an idea for a directive or a piece of law legislation, you went to the agora, to the square, and you stood up there in front of the masses and you delivered your speech in favor of that law. Only difference was that you had to have a hanging noose around your neck. And if the law was passed by everybody else on the square, the noose was removed. If they voted against you, the noose was tied and down you went. That could focus the attention of political parties very considerably. Now, that led me on to think of what the Irish Taoiseach a few years came out with. And that was that we have to realize that whatever definition we have of democracy, Europe is changing in at least one fundamental way, and that is we are now a Europe of multiple allegiances. And he said, I can be a Kerry man, I can be an Irishman, and I can be a European. I heard it from my Tuscan friends. I'm first of all, he said, a Tuscan. Then I'm a European, and then maybe third, I'm an Italian. And it's this notion of multiple allegiances that I think will hold sway in the future. But one area where we didn't cover is the area of the actual minorities in Europe. And the question of democracy as far as what people have called the hidden nations of Europe are concerned. We're thinking of the Basques, or the Galicians, of the Catalonians, of the 14 areas in Italy. We've got special regional status of the United Kingdom and what's going to happen there. And I think the future is also going to be very much involved with how do we deal with those kind of minorities, including the linguistic minorities. And we didn't touch about language as an issue. It is one of the key elements in any development of identity, whether minority or national. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a simple question, in a way. Anybody on the panel wants to remark on that?
I just would say that, I mean, this is what we were hearing this morning, weren't we, when there was this talk of cosmopolitanism. I think that was the phrase that was being used. This recognition, you know, isn't it the classic definition of what a federation is supposed to be? It's unity in diversity. Mm-hmm. And so I fundamentally disagree with the professor who spoke this morning. I don't know if she's still here, about how the solution to the future of Europe is less democracy. Maybe I'm misinterpreting her and I'm being unfair to her, but I would fundamentally disagree with that view.
That's an interesting topic. Yes.
Yeah, and commenting on what was said about identity earlier. I mean, I was just thinking about this. We were talking about nationalism and identity coming from, you know, either ethnicity or, you know, habitation in a place, or Renan would say, you know, a volonté to be together. And if we look back at nation-state developments, then through such a process, do we also think that, at the European level, that is something that we need to do, or is that the way forward? Yeah.
Can I?
David, yeah.
Because this sort of come up a few times. You're talking about your convention approach, and if I was to be allowed to have a bit of advice there, I would be suggesting, we're very different. We're far better educated. We're far more mobile. The citizenry are a far more sophisticated body than they would have been in the development of nation-state times. So therefore, we have to tweak our models to suit that. Mm-hmm. And I would be saying to you, for example, in your convention model, you definitely need your experts, but they shouldn't be members of the process. They should be advising it. Mm-hmm. They should be outside of the process, giving their advice as experts, but stepping away from the decision-making. And I would bring the citizens into the room in their place. I would have your citizens sitting there with your lobbyists and your politicians.
They have a say, but not the final say.
Yeah. The experts steer it and correct things where there's misinterpretations and give as much sage advice as experts should be allowed to give. They should not be excluded, but they shouldn't be part of the process other than that.
Like a forensic expert in a jury trial.
Yeah. Yes.
5 more interventions from the audience is registered. You first.
Thank you. My name is Erik Storelve. From listening from today's conference, it sounds like the European Union has a lot of problems. But I just want to make these questions to correct a bit impression, because first of all, my impression is that the European institutions are working better and better, actually improving cooperation, solving more problems. And the problems and the challenge faced in Europe, the paradox is that the answer to these problems are very often more European Union policies. You look on the financial regulation, energy challenge, climate change, security issues, immigrants into the European Union. All the answer to these problems are more European policies. And it looks for me that the European Union is working better and better. So we have been discussing theoretical alternatives to the democratic process and institutions we have. But please correct the impression if you think otherwise than I'm doing here.
Yes. Svein Rotevatn.
Well, I agree with you that it's not an entirely a black picture, and I think there is reason for optimism on behalf of several aspects of how the European Union is working today. And I think, for example, the European elections this spring, even though there's been criticism towards how the people voted in several countries, I think some of the reasons that I see cause for optimism is, the main difficulty with European democracy has been that you don't have a common language, you don't have a common sphere of public debate, but both of those things are improving, and I think in these elections you saw some real genuine pan-European debates on important issues like welfare, like immigration, especially the links between welfare and immigration, about financial regulation. So even though there's a long way to go, I think a lot of things are moving in the right direction. And you also saw that the election turnout was stabilizing after falling for many, many years. And I also think that the new concept of the Spitzenkandidaten is even though you might dislike it as a copy of what happens at the national level, I think it's a genuine improvement of European democracy, and it's very, very interesting to watch what happens next, being that the Council actually accepted the Spitzenkandidaten from the biggest group as the new Commission President, despite heavy opposition from important nation states in Europe. And in my opinion, that was a move in the right direction, towards more democracy in Europe and not less.
Okay. Yes, Adolf.
Yeah, and when we think about, how well is the EU working, I guess we have input legitimacy, output legitimacy, so coming up with good outcomes. Do we have enough things going in? Is there enough sort of representation? And I guess we're making progress on the representation side, as we just heard with Spitzenkandidaten. And I guess, we're not perhaps doing so well on the outcome side. And then what I quite enjoy now is I was reading a paper recently by a scholar called Vivian Schmidt she writes about throughput legitimacy, what comes in between input and output, and sort of the black box in the middle. And that, you know, the throughput legitimacy in the EU side would be, you know, the relationship between the different institutions, the transparency, accountability, things like that. And perhaps we're making progress there, but I'm not sure if we've done enough on the input and the output side.
Okay. There are still 5 interventions listed on my paper here. There were 4, it came 5, and then it's you first now.
My name is Jacques Ducry. I come from Switzerland, but my English is terrible. It's with Deutsch or French speech und Generalsekretär von Swiss European Movement wird translate. Thank you, sorry. En Suisse, on a 4 langues. German, French, Italian et Rätoromanisch. 2 religions, protestants et catholiques. On a les Alpes, on a 26 républiques, donc cantons. On a une Freiheit von Gemeinden, von Kantonen und 3. Niveau ist Schweiz. Wir wählen unsere Repräsentanten in Gemeinden, Exekutiv, Legislativ, in Kantonen und Bikameralismus-System wie in Belgium, Ständerat und Nationalrat. Wir haben Referendum. 50.000 Einwohner können in 3 Monaten schreiben gegen ein Gesetz, das Parlament macht. Okay.
Well, I think that's okay, wasn't it?
I think it's okay.
I think anyone actually understood that.
Shortly how we have it in Switzerland with 4 languages, minorities, and the political system with a lot of participation. There's the referendum, either the facultative or the referendum where you can change decisions that have been made before.
On a aussi l'initiative avec 100 000 citoyens qui peuvent demander au peuple et au canton de décider quelque chose. Madame a dit avant que le vote aux femmes suisses a été introduit en 1971. Mais pourquoi ça?
So we have this initiative where you can come up with anything, put it in the constitution. But the only thing you need is 100,000 signatures and a positive vote. So the question has been come up about the right to vote for women that has been in 71 in Switzerland, and you want to tell us why that happened, right?
J'ai pas compris ce qu'il a dit. Hein. Est-ce que il n'y a pas trop de démocratie? C'était une journée fantastique. Je remercie Catherine qui nous a invités en tant qu'Européens suisses. On est très rares en Suisse, mais on est très fort. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas trop de démocratie en Suisse? Qu'est-ce que la Suisse pourrait être un exemple pour l'Europe? Je pose la question à monsieur, au professeur, comment vous vous appelez, Van Rijbroek, monsieur le
Van Rijbroek,
de la Belgique,
David, oui.
aux 2 représentants d'un État unitaire que c'est la Norvège, et aussi au professeur Farrell qui est en train de bâtir quelque chose de nouveau. Est-ce que la Suisse, ce système démocratique marche? Parce que j'aimerais vous rappeler quelque chose. En 2005, le peuple français et le peuple néerlandais ont voté contre la Constitution européenne qui avait été faite par M. Giscard d'Estaing et M. Giuliano Amato aussi. Il ne faut pas oublier l'Italie parfois. Alors, est-ce que ça a été bien que le peuple a voté ou pas? L'Irlande, je crois qu'elle a voté, l'Espagne a voté, le Luxembourg a aussi voté. Est-ce que c'est bien, dans un moment où il y a surtout le pouvoir de la finance et le pouvoir des populismes, est-ce que c'est bien qu'il y ait encore autant de démocratie, ou est-ce qu'il ne faut pas donner aux organes institutionnels plus de pouvoir afin que les représentants puissent exercer leur pouvoir? Mais la question est, est-ce que la Suisse pourrait marcher pour l'Europe ou pas? Voilà, merci.
So, the right to vote for women also was introduced that late because of direct democracy. and it would have probably been the same case in other countries. So the question is now, isn't there also possibility to have too much democracy, to have too much participation of the people, and whether Switzerland could be an example, either to have too much rights of participation or to have a very good and functional democracy.
Yeah. Short and
Yeah,
simple.
I would-
Short and simple question requires a short and simple
Oh,
answer.
I understand French. That helps. So, it's yeah. Say again.
What does that mean?
I understood French, so it was easy. It was easy to. No, but you did a fantastic job. I couldn't have done it. A painful diplomatic incident has just been avoided. The question is important. And can there be too much democracy, given that in Swiss there's so many referenda, and you had referendums in the European Union, the European Treaty? Shouldn't that sort of decision sometimes not be taken by people representing the people rather than the people itself? I think it's an interesting question, but I don't agree with the answer that was suggested and the need, like, yes, sometimes there is perhaps too much democracy. I don't think there can be too much democracy. I only think there can be too many poor procedures. And nowadays, we have elections where you can color something next to somebody's name, and in referendum, you can put a cross next to a yes or a no. These are the two main instruments being used by contemporary democracies. I think that's pretty weak. If you look at what has been possible in Ireland, for the very first time, you have people actually talking to each other, talking to politicians. And so I don't think there can be too much democracy. I think democracy, indeed, some of the procedures have become outdated, but there are ways to improving them in order to have more democracy.
That's a good answer. Okay, then we'll take the next one. There was a question there first.
Thank you.
You're on the list, actually. The problem is that we're running out of time, and there's still quite a lot of people on the list still.
Who would decide? You said sometimes that people shouldn't decide anything. So who is deciding what is going to the people and what stays in the parliament?
Yeah, it's a good question. We just had this discussion here, should Norway join the EU or not, and who should be at the... If you see that the Norwegian parliament is in favor and that there's a fear of referendum, then I would strongly urge the Norwegian parliament to organize that sort of event, yes.
Yeah, good luck. That was a good question. Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Eirik Bergesen. I'm head of the European movement in Oslo. I'm also a former student at UCD in Dublin, Erasmus student. So I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad to hear what you had to say, and the rest of the panel. And actually, all throughout today, I think that we've able to establish what Ansha Loken said, that people are not interested in democracy in the abstract. However, this is democracy in the abstract. We're interested in it. We've had an interesting debate, but people as such might not be interested in it. And I think that there are few things that are as elitist and boring as to talk about as a democratic deficit. However, it does not change the fact that there is a democratic deficit. And we have to find inventive ways of coming past that. And I'd also like to mention, in addition to the Irish deliberative forums, how the Icelandic have amended their constitution through social media. It's also a modern way, and I think this is a comment. It's not a question. It's one of those Norwegians, isn't it? So that questions, so I'll make it easy for you. Just approve what you've said, and also just like to add how important it is, and having worked at the Norwegian EU delegation itself, not to let politicians get away with sort of saying that we're taking care of business on your behalf, because that's at best patronizing. And even though we do have a Europe minister now, which I think is a good construction, politicians hate to admit lack of influence. And it's easy to say that we are taking care of things, and there are challenges, obviously. And it's difficult for them to say, sort of point at the huge deficit and show how little sort of instruments we have in place. So thank you again to you and also to the European movement administration for putting this together. Thanks.
Okay. Jonas Myhre.
My name is Jonas Myhre. Just a few observations. First of all, we should not forget that the EEA agreement was voted by a qualified majority in the Norwegian Storting. Everybody was quite aware of the fact that there was no influence, no sitting around the table where decisions were made. But what was quite clear was the importance of the matter of being a part of the internal market, to have a level field of competition, and that the same provisions in the EU and EA system should be interpreted and also put into effect in the same manner in order to have this area for economic activity within the whole included EU and EA area. The problem for the yes movement for membership is that this agreement has been working too well. Because as the report given in 2012 demonstrated, it has been an enormous advantage for Norway. Norway has also been heard in important matters where Norway had a special qualification to say something within the energy field, for instance, where we are not only suppliers but also have expertise which the EU has been drawing on. Now, as for the next step, yes, the possibility for Norway to join EU, that is a project with some perspectives. The alternatives mentioned here, I think, are very interesting, and I think that we should be quite aware of that in Norway there's a question between differences between the elite and grassroots. And the task is to make ordinary, enlightened people aware of the fact that the EU have problems, as we have discussed, but to have a hand on the steering wheel is quite important. Finally, deficit within EU, yes, that was planned, and as has been said, and I want to stress that, during the whole process, the national parliaments are those who are in command. And they have decided to what extent they want to join and give some of the sovereignty for the common good internationally. And that balancing is still the case, that the national parliaments have the last word. It is up to the national parliaments to reduce or increase the power of the central power. We should not forget that. Thank you.
That goes for Norway and that goes for every other.
Yes.
All the members of the EU as well. Any comments from the panel on that? No? Yes, Sveinung?
Well, just a couple. I think you're perfectly right that the EEA agreement has a democratic mandate from the Storting, and it still has. But you also have to remember that it's mostly a choice of people seeing it as the lesser of two evils. And then, of course, the people who want to join Europe see, not being part of the single market as the bigger evil, and the people who want to leave the single market see joining the EU as the bigger evil. And then you sort of settle on the EEA agreement, and I guess you could call it a undemocratic success story in a way, because it works in every aspect except democracy. But then you have to realize, I think also, that all the nations being part of the EU that have chosen to share their sovereignty, to pool their sovereignty, they also have a choice, and they can choose to leave if they want to. And in that respect, it's very interesting to follow the debate going on in the UK, of course, to see what happens there in the next parliament if the government is re-elected. And of course, people there, some of them are fantasizing about joining the EEA or having an EEA-like model, seeing that as a better way to connect with the EU. But in my experience, everyone who is British and presented to how the EEA actually works, they ran away from the idea immediately. For example, we had a meeting of British parliamentarians who visited the Norwegian parliament a couple of weeks ago, and were very interested in how the EEA agreement worked. And when the meeting was finished, they were not all that interested in joining the EEA, to put it mildly.
Interesting. Then it was Ringa.
Sorry. You might remember, some of you at least, Margaret Thatcher once saying, there is no such thing as society. And I totally agree with her, because I think society is what we construct. And as you said, Anshul, we have constructed the nation states quite right, as you say, top down. The cultural standardization of the nation state is an elite project. So I would like to ask David, but you can all respond to it. Who should construct a society in the model that you propose? I know parties are not perfect, but after all, they have some kind of direction for us, so we can vote on the least evil party, or whatever you should call it.
I can't on that.
But your question, is it still on? Your question seems to suggest that political parties still create and model society. That might be the case in Norway, but it's not the case everywhere. I don't have the impression that Hungarian parties or Italian parties are still there to shape Italian or Hungarian society. I rather see them as political entrepreneurs who try to get political legitimacy through process of ideological marketing, rather than being the creation. And if you say like the nation state has been like the elite project for crafting, that was mostly before the time of political parties. There's this fantastic book about France. It's called From Peasants into Frenchmen. And it's if you know the title, you know the book. France in 1800 consisted of peasants, and 1 century later they were ready to die for France in the First World War. So what happened in 100 years' time? Basically, the French state did everything so people started feeling French, using the power of education, power of media, compulsory military training, shifting around of churches. So there was a whole program of making people proud of being Frenchmen and French women. But that was mostly done before the age of mass political parties. Mass political parties are basically an invention of the very late 19th century. So you could even say, ever since political parties took power, the nation-building project was a bit over. Unless in single-party states.
Anyone else of you want to comment on that?
I mean, I'd be slightly less, I'm glass half full, as I said earlier on, so I'd be slightly less pessimistic than David about the future parties. I was involved in a book project a few years ago with 2 other colleagues, trying to look at the role parties have in elections today, and we were looking at a cross-national study. And parties still, the vast majority of candidates who are elected to parliaments around developed democracies are elected through political parties. The campaigns are fought by political parties. The issues are put to the electorate by political parties. The voters vote on those issues that are put to them by the political parties. The parties produce the policy output of the parliaments, and then they run for election with a fresh manifesto the following election. So parties still have a role.
Yeah.
The question I often ask my undergraduate students is, can you name a democracy on this planet that doesn't have political parties in its parliament? I'll give you an answer. Tuvalu.
What?
Tuvalu.
What is Tuvalu?
It's a little Polynesian island state with 10,000 citizens.
I thought it was sort of candy. Okay. There is not the last one, but the second last question is there, if you can hear.
Thank you. My name is Torben Williamson. I'm representing the European movement in Bergen, Hordaland. There's a number of questions I would like to ask, but taking this model from Ireland, I mean, the crisis in Greece is both institutional and democratic, as I see it. Now, how could you apply your solution on the Greek situation when the crisis occurred? Would that be a strategy how would you apply it? Just be easy.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to give a sense that Ireland is a virtuous country that does things perfectly. I'm the first to condemn my country and the politicians in my country for all sorts of failings to this day. And as I was saying to David in our conversation earlier on, what happened in Ireland was a pure accident. So we had our crisis, we had our meltdown in 2009, and we just happened to be having an election in 2011. So the rascals were kicked out. The party that was held to blame for the crisis were kicked out of office. A new broom was brought in, and they had said in their election manifestos, we're going to do something serious about this. So they were forced, in a sense, to bring forward the idea for the convention. So we were very lucky. Timing worked to our benefit. And I suppose we have politicians that are perhaps slightly lower on the corruption scale than you might find in Greece, I imagine. So that helps as well. So in an ideal world, Greece would have had that sort of accidental circumstance, and maybe they could have done it as well, but it doesn't look like they're ever going to. God help them.
David, I'm afraid I have bad news. Your train is leaving in 6 minutes. It takes 6 minutes to get to the train. I think that concludes the debate, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panel. Glenn, would you like to say a few rapid concluding words? Blow the flute.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us. And thank you to the panel. And again, I would like to thank our General Secretary. And